So in this particular lesson, we're just going to run through the different files and folders and the projects that we were given when we created our projects using the .NET CLI. And if we take a look inside the reactivity solution, well, this is not really for human eyes, but it does include all of the references to our projects that we added earlier on. And we can see domain, application, persistence, etc. And we're not going to touch this one directly at any stage in this course, but this is so that our code editors or our ADEs knows which projects are part of the solution. And what we also have in here is our three class libraries, the application, domain, persistence, and our API. And if we go and take a look at what's inside this particular folder, well, we can see that we've got our class1.cs class. Now this is just a demo of a class in C#, and it's got no logic inside there at all, so it doesn't actually do anything. And what we also have inside here is our CS_proj file. Now this has a reference to the project SDK, which in this case is Microsoft.NET SDK. Pretty standard, you'll see this in all of our different projects. If the project contains any references to other projects, then they're contained inside here with a project reference tag. And in the case of our persistence, we're including our domain project as its dependency. And each of our projects is going to contain a target framework reference. And in the case of our class libraries, these are targeting Net Standard 2.0. Now this is going to be fine for the beginning of the course, but what we're going to find is we're going to need to change this to target a higher level of the target framework. Because Entity Framework Core, the 3.0 version, only targets Net Core App 3.0. And what we'll find is that when we start adding additional dependencies, such as Entity Framework, we're going to need to update this. And when we update this in one, we're going to be updating it in all of our different CS_proj files. So whilst Net Standard 2.0 is fine for now, and what Microsoft typically recommend is you start with the lowest version of the framework you can target for maximum compatibility. For example, this persistence project could be used if targeting Net Standard 2.0 in .NET Core 2.0 projects as well as .NET Framework, the full framework version. But when we increase this to Net Core App 3.0, it's no longer going to be compatible with other types of frameworks. So things like Xamarin, the full framework, etc. is only going to be compatible with a Net Core App or .NET Core 3.0 application. Now what we also have inside here is a bin and an object file. Now I don't particularly need or want to see these inside my Solution Explorer. I'd rather them disappear because these get recreated every time we build our project and they're just noise inside our Solution Explorer. So what we could do is we can come into Code and Preferences and go to the settings, and if we just search for exclude, then we can specify patterns of things that we want to exclude. Now I've already got bin and object in here, but this only refers to bin and object at the solution level, whereas these are inside folders. So what I'm going to do is just going to edit this particular pattern, and if you don't see anything inside here because you've just installed VS Code, that's absolutely fine, and you can just go ahead and add the pattern. But since I've already got bin and obj in here, what I'm going to do is just edit this and give it a wildcard and say exclude any bin folders inside any projects and click OK, and we should find a bin folder disappears. And I'm just going to do the same for obj and also remove this from my Explorer view. Just don't need to see them. They're not folders that we interact with in any way, and are just folders that are created whenever we build our projects. So that makes me feel a little bit better that they've gone from Solution Explorer. So if we take a look at our domain CS_proj file, we'll find that it's got no project references at all because it has no dependencies on anything else. And the application project, same goes for this. We've got our project references and not much else going on inside there. Now our API project, if we take a look at this one, we'll start with the CS_proj file. Again, there's nothing different going on except for the target framework. This one does target Net Core App 3.0. Now what this gives us access to is APIs for .NET Core 3.0. And we need to reference this in our API projects. But as I mentioned, when we start adding dependencies to our class libraries, such as Entity Framework Core 3.0, we're going to need to raise the target framework inside of our class libraries as well. And that's fine, we'll do that as and when we come onto it. Now what we've also got is this project reference, and what this also does is it implicitly adds a reference to a meta package called Microsoft ASP.NET Core.app. And it's this particular meta package or shared framework package that gives us access to a lot of APIs without us needing to manually add them into our dependencies inside our CS proj file. Now in .NET Core 3.0 they removed a significant number of these dependencies, and we do need to add a lot more things manually to our projects. And that's not a problem, that's absolutely fine. But this course was originally recorded on .NET Core 2.2 and we had access to a larger number of assemblies inside the shared framework than we do in .NET Core 3.0. So what I'm doing as part of updating this course to work with .NET Core 3.0 is when we do need to manually add a dependency for that particular lesson, I'm just going to add a short intro at the start of the lesson, and we'll just go ahead and manually install a dependency that we need as and when we come to it. So these are our project files covered, but when we start our application, several things are going to happen. We're going to run a web server, we're going to load up some configuration files, we're going to configure our logging, and let's take a look at what's responsible for that. And we'll start off with the program.cs class. Now, if you're familiar with .NET development, then you'll be familiar with the concept of a program.cs class. And when we start our application, then .NET is going to look inside this program class for a main method. And this is the method it's going to execute when we start our application. Now, our main method has got one job, and that's to call this method the createHostBuilder. And these arguments, if we supplied any arguments from the command line when we ran our application, and to do that we're going to be using a command .NET run, but we can also specify some arguments that get passed into this particular method and are available then to our createHostBuilder. We're not necessarily going to do that, but just in case you're not aware of what this is for, that's kind of what it's used for. So this method is called, and if we take a look at this method, then what we're returning here is an instance of an iHostBuilder, which is just a program initialization abstraction. And then we've got two methods inside here. We've got this createDefaultBuilder and configureWebHostDefaults. And let's just go and take a look at both of these. And if I just go to the definition of createDefaultBuilder, then in the description here, it's going to tell us what this is actually going to do. And it's going to apply the following defaults. It's going to set the current directory. It's going to load up our configuration for our application from several places. One of them is appsettings.json, which we can see on the left-hand side in Solution Explorer, and also appsettings, whatever environment we're running in, .json. So we've also got an appsettings.development, and also it's going to load configuration from user secrets, and we'll come on to that a bit later on. And what it's also going to do is configure logging as well for our application. So that's one part, and if we take a look at the second part, which is the configure web host defaults, then this one is for our Kestrel web server. So this is going to configure our application to use Kestrel as the web server. Because we're running an API, we need something to host it and run it inside of. And this just sets up Kestrel as our web server. And then what we also do inside here is use a startup class for additional configuration. So let's just swing by that one and take a quick look at what's going on inside here as well. Now, this file we're going to come back to time and time again on this particular course, because this is where we add our application configuration. And there's a few parts to this. First of all, we inject our configuration into our startup class. And this means we can access various application settings inside here. Now, at the moment, we just have these two files, appsettings.json, appsettingsdevelopment.json. And both of these, all they do at the moment is just configure a logging level. And in the case of appsettings.json, the default log level is set to information. And in the case of development, then it's going to be set to debug. So we're going to get much more information about what's going on when we're running our application whilst we're running in development mode. Now, in the case of these configuration files, where we have a more specific file, in the case of development, then this particular logging setting is going to override the equivalent settings in the appsettings.json file. Now, the appsettings.json is read in every mode that we're running in. If we're running in development, if we're running in production, etc. But of course, the app settings.development is only read from when we're running in development mode. So that's our configuration that we see at the moment, and we'll be working with our configuration significantly on this course. So we'll only briefly mention it and keep moving forward. The next method we have inside here is the configure services method. Now, this is our dependency injection container. Any services that we want to be able to consume from other parts of our application, we're going to need to add to our configure services method. Once they're added in here, they're then available for use elsewhere. And we'll be talking about dependency injection a bit later, but that's how we're going to consume services that we create and consume in other areas of our app. Now, we've only got one service that's being added here at the moment, and that's the service to add our controllers. Because we're creating an API, then we're going to have controllers, and our controllers are going to have the endpoints and the methods that we call, which is going to execute our business logic and return the results of whatever we're doing inside that logic. Now, previously in version 2.2 of MVC, what we had here was a call to add MVC. And this method also included support for things that we're not using inside an API, such as razor views, etc. But now in 3.0, they've split that functionality out, and now we've just got the functionality that we need for a web API contained inside here. As I say, we're going to be coming back to this method time and time again to add additional services that we need in our application as we build it. The next method we have inside here is the configure method. And we use this method to configure the HTTP request pipeline. And what this means is that we can add middleware to our request pipeline that's going to do something with our request as it comes in through our pipeline and out of our pipeline. Now, because this is middleware that we add to a pipeline, the ordering of what goes on in here is important. Now, we've got several bits of middleware that we're adding here. First of all, we're going to check to see if we're running in development mode. And if we are, then we're going to use something called the developer exception page. And what this means is that if we do have an exception, then it's going to return a page with detailed information about what caused that particular exception. It's too much information for an application running in production mode, and you certainly wouldn't want to send that information back to an end user when running in production. But for development, this is pretty good because it's going to give us lots of information. And we'll talk about error handling and exceptions a bit later on. What we've also got in here by default is to use HTTPS redirection. Now, we don't really want to mess around with self-signed certificates whilst we're learning to build our application. And what this does is any request that comes in over the HTTP protocol is going to automatically redirect it to HTTPS. Now, we're going to talk about security towards the end of the course in terms of HTTPS, and we're going to turn this off whilst we're developing our application. So we're going to comment this out. And it's just Control// to add a comment or comment out a line inside VS Code. What we've also got is some middleware to tell our application to use routing. Now, when a request comes into our API needs to be able to route it to the appropriate controller. So what we've got here is the middleware to enable that functionality. And what we also have here is another piece of middleware to say app use authorization. Now, we're not going to come on to authentication and authorization for quite some time, but we can just leave this in place. It's not going to mean that we have to authorize to our application because we haven't configured that functionality yet. But we can just leave this in place, even though it's not going to do anything for us just now. We'll come on and talk about that a bit later. And then what we have is a call to use endpoints. And this is going to map our controller endpoints into our API so that our API server knows what to do when a request comes into our API and how to route it to the appropriate controller. Now, we'll go ahead and run our application in the next lesson, but what we also want to do, because we've turned off HTTPS redirection, we don't actually want our application to listen on HTTPS. So when we start our application, inside our properties folder here, we've got this launch settings.json file. And what we're going to do, if we scroll down to the API section, then what we've got here is our two URLs that would be listening when we start our application. Now we've got one for HTTPS and one for HTTP, but as I mentioned, we're not going to be using HTTPS. So I'm just going to remove that particular line or that particular part of this line so that when we start our app, it only listens on localhost 5000. So with that in place, what we're going to take a look at next, because it's an important part of our API, is the API controllers. And we're going to take a look at that next.